Hey guys, tonight we begin with the young king who grew up surrounded by velvet tapestries, polished armor, and the kind of childhood job titles that would make any modern toddler look lazy. So before you settle in, take a slow breath and let your shoulders drop. And if you enjoy these late night history rambles, feel free to subscribe, though only if you really want to, of course, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights, loosen the mind a little, and let us drift into the early world of Henry Tudor, the boy who would one day become Henry VIII and change England whether England liked it or not. Henry arrived in the world in the summer heat of 1491 at the Palace of Placentia, where the air smelled faintly of the river and the clay bricks that held the walls together. The building was not overly grand by later royal standards, but to a child, everything must have felt enormous. High ceilings, long galleries, and the kind of echoes that encourage a little mischief. And Henry did have a streak of mischief throughout his childhood, something historians still debate after reading a few too many reports of tutors exhausted by his energy. He was the third child, and the spare son, the one not meant to inherit anything heavier than a ceremonial sword. Yet even as a toddler, he carried titles like a collector carries stickers. At 2, he was made Constable of Dover Castle and Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports, because why not give a toddler responsibility over coastal defense? By 3, he was Earl Marshal of England and Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, and the list kept growing faster than he did. These titles were ceremonial, of course, but they reveal something deeper about the household he grew up in. Henry VII, his father, was a man who trusted almost no one, and if he could keep power in the family even through a child, he certainly would. So the young Henry became a placeholder, an ornamental barrier between real authority and real nobles, which did not make him powerful, but did make him noticeable. And being noticeable at court meant growing up with the feeling that eyes were always on you, every step weighted with expectation. The boy received a rich education designed for a prince, but not necessarily for a future king. He learned Latin, French, and some Italian because the more languages a tutor knew, the more easily they could gossip across Europe. He studied music, theology, and the classics, and it is said he enjoyed singing with a voice that apparently had some charm, though perhaps that detail was flattered by courtiers who wished to keep their heads attached to their bodies. Who can say for sure? One of the odd details from his youth involves his early induction into the Order of the Garter at age 4, an honor so prestigious that centuries later it still ranks among England's highest recognitions. But imagine a ceremony filled with solemn faces, dignified robes, and in the center a small child, probably more interested in the embroidery than the significance. Henry likely tugged at the fabric while grown men debated the finances of the realm around him. The contrast between his ceremonial life and his real childhood created a strange duality. He was important but powerless, privileged yet kept at a distance. And throughout these early years, his older brother Arthur hovered like a bright star that outshone him. Arthur was the carefully raised heir, while Henry was the charming, lively spare whose fate was uncertain, but whose freedom was slightly more abundant. Arthur's marriage to Catherine of Aragon in 1501 was one of the great ceremonials of Henry's childhood, and Henry took part in the festivities wearing heraldic arms marked with the ermine label that signaled his status as the king's younger son. He watched the spectacle with the fascination of an adolescent who saw his brother stepping into adult responsibilities while he stood at the edge, not yet expected to do the same. Catherine entered the Tudor family surrounded by Spanish dignity and political weight, and Henry observed it all with wide eyes, maybe wondering how Arthur must have felt marrying a princess whose entourage carried as much gold cloth as a small nation. Historians debate whether Henry admired Arthur, envied him, or simply accepted the order of things, but fate intervened before such guesses could form a clear picture. Arthur died suddenly in early 1502, after only a few months of marriage. The shock rolled through the court like a cold wind, and the future of England shifted onto the shoulders of the boy who had not been raised to carry it. Ahamibur, Henry at 10 became the new heir, the Duke of Cornwall, the Prince of Wales, the expected future king, and with these new titles came restrictions. His father tightened control over him, allowing almost no public duties. Arthur had been groomed for rule, while Henry was left waiting in a polished cage, unable to develop the experiences that might have prepared him. This left a curious imprint on his character because a king who has never practiced governance often becomes a king who rules by impulse and flair. Henry grew into adolescence with the restless feeling of someone who knew greatness was waiting yet just out of reach. He watched ambassadors whispering in corners, cardinals moving pieces on the political board, and foreign powers treating England with the kind of caution that told Henry he was part of something larger and heavier than he understood. One of the earliest unusual details of his adolescence was his involvement in the marriage negotiations that followed Arthur's death. His father pushed for Henry to marry Catherine of Aragon to maintain the alliance with Spain, and although this would define his adult life, at the time Henry was too young to grasp the weight of the arrangement. He saw the ritual more than the meaning, the talk of papal dispensations, the whispers about whether Arthur and Catherine had consummated their marriage, the clerical debates over honesty and affinity. All of it swirled around him like smoke, too dense to breathe, yet too important to ignore. In these years, Henry learned more through observation than action. And he learned how alliances were patched and torn, how nobles could be both loyal and opportunistic, how kingship was both gilded and grim. He may not have sat in councils, but he listened, he watched, and he built a foundation of impressions that would later blend into the confident yet unpredictable ruler he became. When Henry VII died in 1509, the young heir was 17. Strong, handsome, athletic, and bursting with a craving to finally step into sunlight after years in the shadows. He embraced kingship as if it were a stage meant for him alone, and England greeted him with relief, hoping that the new reign would shine brighter than the cautious and often dour rule of his father. Little did they know, the boy who grew up surrounded by ceremony and limited freedom would become a king whose need for grandeur and certainty reshaped everything he touched. The early days of Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon unfolded with the kind of hope that feels soft around the edges, the sort of hope you almost whisper so as not to break it. Catherine entered Henry's life carrying both royal dignity and a lingering sadness from her years in political limbo, and for a time the match seemed genuinely warm. Tonight, as we slip deeper into this chapter of his story, imagine the quiet glow of a candle near the end of its wick, gently lighting the scene around you, and let the soft hum of the evening guide you through the slow unraveling of a marriage that began in promise and ended in crisis. Henry stepped into the union with the confidence of a young king eager to prove himself, while Catherine brought experience, diplomacy, and a practiced patience that would be tested more than she ever expected. In the first years, Catherine was not just a consort, but a partner in the work of the crown, supporting Henry's ambitions and stabilizing the political lines between England and Spain. She carried with her the memory of Arthur, Henry's late brother, and though historians still debate how Catherine navigated the emotional weight of having married one brother and then living as the wife of the other, she approached her new role with a poise that made her widely respected at court. Henry admired her dedication, and for a time he valued her counsel, but beneath the surface, pressures began to collect like storm clouds along the horizon, waiting for the right wind to break them open. The earliest trials of their marriage lay in Catherine's repeated pregnancies, each one carrying the hopes of a kingdom desperate for a male heir. The birth of a living son would have strengthened Henry's dynasty and solidified Catherine's place, but fate was stubborn. The first child was stillborn, a short life marked only by grief. Then came a son in 1511 who survived only a few weeks. The joy that filled the court when he was born dissolved almost immediately, and the emotional toll on Catherine must have been immense, though she rarely let it show before others. Her sense of duty ran deeper than her sorrow, but Henry felt the strain too, and while he expressed public sympathy, his impatience for a son grew more fierce with each passing year. Their daughter Mary, born in 1516, brought relief, though not the security Henry craved. She was healthy, strong, and intelligent, but in Henry's eyes, she was not the male successor tradition demanded. Even though many kingdoms across Europe had been led by skilled queens, England under the Tudors was not ready to embrace that possibility yet. So Henry watched Mary grow with love, but also with the uneasy feeling that something essential was missing from his lineage. This displacement between affection and dynastic fear created a tension that wove itself quietly into the fabric of their marriage. Catherine's ability to remain composed while surrounded by misfortune is one of the qualities that made her such a remarkable historical figure. Some records describe her as a woman of deep piety, strict discipline, and a dignity that never wavered even under the public pressure of repeated loss. One of the more unusual details often mentioned about her is her tendency to fast severely, especially during periods of stress, something that today might have caused doctors to raise a few eyebrows, but which in her time was considered a mark of devotion, though some historians believe these practices may have further taxed her health over the years. Regardless, Catherine held herself with a grace that impressed foreign ambassadors who often reported her wisdom and compassion to their masters abroad. Meanwhile, Henry's affections began to wander. The court was filled with ladies of noble birth who danced, sang, and played instruments at court masques and feasts, and Henry enjoyed being admired. He enjoyed being adored, and though many of these affairs were kept discreet enough not to publicly shame Catherine, the knowledge of them could not have been easy for her. The tension between them deepened, not from sudden conflict, but from the slow accumulation of disappointments, small cracks forming in a marriage that had once looked balanced from the outside. As the years passed, Catherine aged and grew increasingly worn by her emotional and physical burdens, while Henry matured into a king more aware of his power and more restless in his desires. By the time she reached her late 30s and early 40s, Catherine's chances of bearing another child had dwindled. Yet she still carried herself as queen with unwavering loyalty, the same loyalty that would later make her one of the most beloved of Henry's wives in the historical imagination. During this period, Henry's court transformed into a place of lavish entertainment, tournaments, hunts, banquets, and diplomatic pageantry, the sort of atmosphere that made a young, energetic king feel larger than life. Henry saw himself as a new Arthur, and perhaps even as a new Constantine, shaping England through both spectacle and strength. Catherine supported these events even when her health faltered. She sat through ceremonies, offered guidance during councils, and hosted visiting diplomats who described her as one of the most learned queens in Europe. Yet it became increasingly clear that being admired for her mind did not secure her position within Henry's heart. The political landscape around them grew more complex as well. Alliances shifted between France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire, and each shift added new pressure to their marriage. Catherine's lineage as the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella had once been an asset, but as European politics changed, it became occasionally inconvenient. And Henry saw in these shifts a reminder that marriage in a royal household was never simply private. It was always a negotiation between nations. Catherine understood this more deeply than Henry did, and she tried to steady the course even while the winds of court gossip blew stubbornly against her. In 1513, Catherine took on the role of regent while Henry was away fighting in France, a rare moment when she wielded significant political authority. During this time, she oversaw England's defense against a Scottish invasion, and the English forces under her direction won decisively at the Battle of Flodden. The victory resulted in the death of James IV of Scotland and secured England's northern border. It is one of the most significant historical achievements of her life, yet in the long view of their marriage, this triumph would later be overshadowed by the conflicts brought about by Henry's quest for a son. Historians still debate how much credit she personally deserves for the strategic decisions at Flodden, but her leadership in that moment strengthened her popularity among the people and demonstrated a resilience that Henry himself found admirable, though not enough to quiet his growing dissatisfaction. By the time Anne Boleyn appeared at court, Catherine's influence had already begun to fade. The years of strain had taken their toll, and Henry no longer looked to her with the same admiration he once felt. Catherine continued to fulfill her duties with dignity even as her world began to tilt. Catherine's long struggle to maintain her marriage and her crown would shape the path ahead for both her and Henry, casting a long shadow over the years that followed and sowing the seeds for the break with Rome that would change England forever. The early years of Henry's reign shimmered with a kind of restless optimism, the sort that fills a young ruler with visions of glory and banners flapping dramatically in the wind like something out of an overly enthusiastic tapestry. As you settle in tonight, let your breath ease and your mind drift toward that youthful Henry, the king who still believed the world could be conquered with charm, athletic talent, and an army that knew how to shine its armor properly. He dreamed of becoming a warrior king, a new Arthur leading England into victory so grand that balladeers would run out of rhymes trying to keep up. And while some of those dreams did come true, others became expensive lessons wrapped in the smell of gunpowder, damp tents, and the polite coughs of frustrated diplomats. Shortly after taking the throne, Henry looked across the English Channel and saw France not as an intimidating rival, but as a stage waiting for his triumph. This early obsession with French campaigns was in part youthful bravado, and in part the influence of older advisors who remembered the glory days of kings who actually won battles instead of just posing for portraits. The idea of reclaiming territories once held by English kings filled Henry's imagination, and he believed that the right combination of alliances and enthusiasm would make it possible. What he lacked in experience he made up for in confidence, which is historically a mixed blessing. The political world around him was thick with shifting alliances like a complicated board game whose rules were being rewritten every time someone sneezed. In 1510, Henry renewed England's alliance with France under King Louis XII, a diplomatic move that pleased some advisors and irritated others. But before the ink on the renewed agreement was even dry, Henry was already eyeing a different direction. Ferdinand of Aragon, his father-in-law, had his own goals, and he nudged Henry toward conflict with France, presenting it as both noble and strategically wise. Ferdinand was extremely good at getting other people to fight his battles, something historians still mention with a tone of admiration mixed with side-eye. By 1511, Pope Julius II added his own piece to the chessboard when he formed the Holy League against France. Henry saw this as an opportunity to align himself with the Pope and to step onto the European stage as a bold young monarch. The charisma of the crusading idea appealed to him, and the flattery coming from Rome painted him as a potential champion of Christendom. Whether Henry was truly motivated by piety or by the chance to be admired across Europe is something historians still debate, though the answer probably sits somewhere in the middle with a slight lean toward vanity. In 1512, Henry authorized a military campaign against France, though he did not lead this first attempt personally. The English army under the command of the Marquess of Dorset sailed to Spain in a joint plan with Ferdinand. The idea was that Ferdinand would invade Guyenne and help restore English control there while Henry provided the manpower. Unfortunately, Ferdinand decided to pursue his own interests in Navarre instead, leaving the English stranded and confused. Imagine marching into battle, expecting heroic music, only to discover half the orchestra never showed up. The campaign failed miserably, and Henry learned a valuable lesson about trusting allies who smile too much. Not discouraged by the setback, Henry prepared for another attempt. This time he sought a stronger alliance, not just with Spain, but also with Emperor Maximilian. The Pope offered Henry the enticing idea of being crowned King of France if he succeeded in defeating King Louis, which was exactly the kind of thing that made Henry's imagination spin with chivalric fantasies. He pictured himself riding triumphantly through Paris, perhaps wearing slightly more gold than necessary, and the vision stuck. In 1513, Henry finally led an army himself, marching into France with all the enthusiasm of a man who had waited years for this moment. The campaign produced the Battle of the Spurs, a name that makes it sound more intense than it was. Essentially, the French cavalry panicked and ran, and the English chased them energetically. Despite the comedic undertones, the victory allowed Henry to capture Therouanne and Tournai, and England celebrated the triumph enthusiastically. These military successes offered a boost to Henry's reputation, making him look like a king who could indeed live up to the heroic image he treasured. However, the glow of victory in France was blunted by events at home. While Henry was away, James IV of Scotland decided it was an excellent time to invade England, perhaps encouraged by King Louis, who enjoyed stirring trouble for his enemies. Catherine of Aragon, acting as regent while Henry campaigned abroad, oversaw England's defense. The English forces met the Scots at the Battle of Flodden in September of 1513, delivering one of the most decisive victories in Anglo-Scottish history. James IV was killed, along with much of the Scottish nobility. Catherine reportedly sent Henry a piece of James's coat as a token of triumph, though whether Henry appreciated this rather strong gesture is uncertain. The irony here is that while Henry dreamed of being the great warrior king, it was Catherine who actually presided over one of England's most important military victories during his reign. An odd twist of fate, and one that court poets did not emphasize too loudly. Still, the successes of 1513 boosted Henry's confidence and convinced him that his destiny as a conquering monarch was within reach. Courtiers noticed a shift in him after these campaigns, a greater sense of theatrical pride, and a willingness to embrace the grand narrative of his own reign. Yet the cost of war was immense, and by 1514 England's treasury was depleted. The alliances that Henry believed so firmly in began to waver as Ferdinand and Maximilian made their own peace with France, leaving Henry feeling somewhat abandoned. Diplomacy required a steady hand and a willingness to accept political realities, neither of which aligned perfectly with Henry's appetite for glory. When peace was negotiated with France later that year, it was clear that the adventurous campaigns had brought fewer lasting gains than Henry had hoped, though they had certainly satisfied his need for spectacle. One of the unusual details from this period that sometimes gets overlooked is Henry's habit of personally participating in tournaments and athletic events, even while juggling international conflicts. His competitive streak was relentless. He played tennis with a level of intensity usually reserved for battlefield strategy. He wrestled diplomats if the mood struck him. And he insisted on being the star of every pageant. This restless need to shine fueled both his successes and his frustrations. It made him magnetic, but also impulsive, and it shaped the way he viewed politics, military power, and even personal relationships. By the end of these early campaigns, Henry had gained a taste of glory, but also a sharper sense of the limits of royal power. He had learned that alliances were fragile, that victories could be expensive, and that even triumphant kings were bound by the ebb and flow of European politics. Still, the young king believed the future held greater triumphs waiting just beyond the horizon, and with Catherine at home balancing diplomacy, he felt the stage was set for even grander pursuits. The rise of Cardinal Wolsey in Henry's early reign unfolded with the smooth confidence of a man who understood court politics the way a seasoned musician understands the strings of a lute. As we settle into this next stretch of the story, let your breath soften and picture the warm hush of a late evening room where the candlelight sways gently and the world feels just a little bit slower. Wolsey's ascent from the son of a butcher to the most powerful man in England after the king is one of those historical turns that feels almost unreal and yet entirely inevitable once you watch how he moved through Henry's world. While Henry dreamed of glory, Wolsey quietly organized the entire machinery needed to make those dreams look effortless. When Henry first inherited the throne, he was enthusiastic, eager, and not yet particularly interested in the tedious parts of kingship. He wanted music, tournaments, hunting, and the occasional French conquest. The heavy administrative work he gladly handed to others. Into this space stepped Thomas Wolsey with an instinct for power so sharp it could slice parchment. Wolsey understood Henry's personality and used it to craft a political partnership that suited them both. Henry received a government that ran smoothly, and Wolsey received influence so vast it bordered on royal. Historians still debate whether Wolsey guided Henry or simply carried out Henry's whims with incredible efficiency, but most agree the truth sits somewhere in the threshold between those possibilities. Wolsey's talent for administration became clear quickly. He organized taxation with chilling precision, negotiated treaties with careful phrasing, and managed court factions with the kind of diplomacy that suggested he could charm a stone statue if necessary. His abilities earned him religious promotions as well, rising through church ranks until he became Archbishop of York and eventually Cardinal, giving him authority not only in political matters but also over the spiritual landscape of England. In a system where titles usually flowed through noble bloodlines, Wolsey's rise from humble origins was highly unusual. Some nobles whispered about his father's trade as if being the son of a butcher made him unsuitable for power, though they never whispered too loudly. Wolsey had a long memory and a short temper. His control over the court grew especially strong through his position as Lord Chancellor, a role that placed him at the center of nearly every major decision. Foreign ambassadors learned quickly that speaking to Henry meant little unless Wolsey approved of the message. Even the style in which Wolsey carried himself made an impression. He traveled with such grandeur that his processions sometimes outshone the king's. There is an account, though embellished in tone, that describes his household containing more servants than some small towns. Whether that number was exaggerated or not, the effect was the same. Wolsey moved through England as a force unto himself. Henry appreciated Wolsey's ability to transform his personal ambitions into functioning policy. When Henry wanted war, Wolsey found the money. When Henry wanted peace, Wolsey negotiated it. When Henry desired recognition, Wolsey orchestrated the international displays that made Henry appear as a glittering figure on the European stage. One such moment was the Treaty of London in 1518, a sweeping agreement that called for universal peace among major European powers. It was a diplomatic masterpiece that elevated England from a middling kingdom to a respected broker of continental harmony. For a brief moment, the idea of general peace felt real, though historians still debate whether Wolsey believed in the ideal or merely enjoyed the prestige it brought him. One of the more unusual details from this period involves Wolsey's flair for theatrics during negotiations. He reportedly arranged meetings in rooms draped with rich fabrics and filled with carefully placed luxuries, all designed to overwhelm visiting diplomats. Imagine walking into a diplomatic chamber expecting a polite discussion only to find a room so extravagant it looks like a jewel box that exploded. This strategy worked more often than not, diplomacy influenced by ambiance, proving that sometimes velvet can be sharper than steel. Despite his immense power, Wolsey's relationship with Henry was built on delicate balance. Henry trusted Wolsey, but the king also expected obedience and unwavering loyalty. Wolsey, in turn, understood that his influence existed only because Henry allowed it. If he ever failed to deliver what Henry wanted, he knew his authority would crumble. This understanding kept Wolsey working tirelessly, often sleeping little and traveling constantly to manage the ever-changing needs of the realm. His life became a masterclass in political survival, though no one survives forever in the orbit of a Tudor king. As Henry's ambition shifted from martial glory to dynastic stability, Wolsey found himself drawn deeper into the king's personal concerns, especially regarding the lack of a male heir. Though this crisis had not yet reached its peak, the early murmurs shaped Wolsey's later downfall. For now, however, he remained at the height of his power, guiding England's foreign policy, domestic reform, and the daily pulse of the court with unmatched precision. Henry looked upon him with approval, seeing in Wolsey the perfect instrument for carrying out his vision. But beneath the polished surface, tensions brewed. The nobility resented Wolsey's control and whispered about his arrogance. Foreign rulers questioned whether England's positions were Henry's or Wolsey's, and Henry himself slowly began to mature, shifting from a young king content to delegate authority to one who wanted to assert himself more directly. The seeds of change lay dormant, but they would one day grow into the force that toppled Wolsey from the height of his influence. For now, Wolsey stood strong, his brilliance undeniable, his authority unmatched, his partnership with Henry seemingly unbreakable. England, under the pair, became a stage filled with enormous risks and enormous spectacle, the calm before the tempest that would one day reshape church and crown alike. And as Henry continued to dream of glory, Wolsey remained the great architect behind the throne, guiding the king's ambitions with a steady hand and an eye always fixed on the shifting patterns of power. Anne Boleyn entered Henry's world not with the thunder of prophecy, but with the soft rustle of French-styled sleeves and a mind sharp enough to slice through the silk of courtly manners. As we drift into this next part of the story, let your breath fall into an easy rhythm and picture the dim corridors of a Tudor palace lit by low torches, the sound of distant music echoing through the halls, while a king's attention begins to shift in ways that no one yet understands. Anne did not arrive intending to change England, yet her presence would become the spark that altered the course of a kingdom and the pulse of Henry's own fate. Before Anne made her mark, she spent years in the courts of Burgundy and France, immersed in the polished culture of European nobility. This background shaped her into something rare by English standards, a woman educated, confident, and familiar with the sophisticated manners of continental courts. She carried herself with a quiet poise, but also with a lively wit that caught attention wherever she moved. One odd detail from her time abroad hints at her early talent for charm. She was reportedly skilled at playing the lute and singing French chansons softly in the evenings. And though that may sound like a footnote, it mattered in a court where cultural grace was often a political weapon. Anne learned early how to perform the art of attraction without ever giving away more than she intended. When she returned to England around 1522, she did not immediately enter Henry's orbit. Instead, she caught the notice of courtiers with her dark eyes, fashionable French gowns, and her refusal to blend into the background. At one of the elaborate court masques, she danced with the confidence of someone aware that everyone was watching. These masks were theatrical performances filled with music, shifting fabric, and elaborate props, and they provided the perfect stage for both romance and rivalry. Henry noticed her there, though only faintly at first. His attention was still divided between political frustrations and other fleeting affections. Anne served Catherine of Aragon as a lady-in-waiting, a role that placed her close to the Queen, and within the daily movement of royal life, Catherine reportedly admired Anne's skill in embroidery and courtly manners, but perhaps sensed a spark in her that could one day be troublesome. Some historians still debate whether Catherine recognized the early danger Anne posed, though the records offer more silence than certainty on this point. The real turning point began when Henry revived his interest in Anne's sister Mary Boleyn, whose earlier affair with the king had already tilted the Boleyn family into a politically sensitive space. The Boleyns were ambitious, equal parts charismatic and calculating, and they understood that influence moved not merely through treaties but also through proximity to the king. Henry's first direct fascination with Anne emerged slowly. He sent her small gifts, trinkets that carried affectionate symbolism, and letters that have survived through centuries filled with longing, written in Henry's restless handwriting. But Anne did something unusual, something that would shift the balance of power between them. She refused him, politely but decisively. While many women would have accepted the king's advances as a path to wealth and security, Anne insisted she would not become his mistress. She understood exactly what such a position meant: a temporary affection without lasting power, a role that ended when the king's attention drifted elsewhere. Anne wanted more, or perhaps she simply refused to lose herself in Henry's desires. Either way, her refusal transformed her from an object of interest into a challenge, and few things attracted Henry more than being denied what he believed he could easily claim. Her defiance stirred something in him that Catherine's steady devotion never had. Henry began to see Anne not just as a woman, but as a possible queen, a figure who could give him the male heir he believed God had withheld from Catherine. Rumors in the court swirled more quickly each month, some claiming Anne used French flirtation techniques, others saying she practiced caution and ambition with equal skill. One unusual rumor suggested she wore a double-tipped sleeve to hide a small deformity on one finger, though historians still debate whether this was political slander fabricated by her enemies or merely exaggerated gossip. Regardless, these whispers built an aura around her of mystery and danger, the kind of courtly myth-making that often surrounds women who challenge traditional roles. As Henry's interest deepened, the political stakes began to rise. Anne's presence at court created tension between Catherine's supporters and those who saw opportunity in aligning with the Boleyn family. Diplomats reported with increasing frequency that the king spent long hours speaking privately with Anne, exchanging gifts, and planning a future that seemed impossible under existing religious law. The word annulment began to circulate, though only in whispers at first, and only among those daring enough to imagine England without Catherine of Aragon as queen. Henry's admiration for Anne grew into something nearly obsessive. He admired her intelligence, her philosophy, her interest in religious reform, and her ability to hold her own in conversation. He also admired her refusal to fall instantly into his arms, which fed the thrill of pursuit like a sport. Anne became the center of court attention, surrounded by allies, enemies, and the curious, all watching to see how far her influence would reach. The more Henry desired her, the more carefully Anne managed her position, always maintaining enough distance to ensure her value remained intact. This delicate dance between them unfolded as Europe watched with fascination and dread. Monarchs and ambassadors wondered how far the young king would go for a woman whose presence had disrupted the established balance of royal marriage, diplomacy, and religious stability. The answer, of course, would reshape history. But in these early years, the break had not yet come, only the tremors. Henry's impatience transforming into resolve, Anne's resistance slowly becoming partnership, and the first cracks forming in a union that had defined the kingdom for more than 2 decades. By the time Henry realized how deeply he wanted Anne, the path ahead was lined with complications, political, spiritual, and personal. But he stepped forward anyway, driven by a mixture of desire, pride, and the belief that destiny waited on the other side of Catherine's quiet sorrow. Anne stood poised between triumph and danger, knowing that the king's affection could lift her higher than any woman in England, but could also place her directly in the center of storms, powerful enough to shake kingdoms apart. And so the curtain lifted on a story that would soon reshape the crown, the church, and the fate of every person who dared to stand near its blazing center. The great matter did not begin with a roar, but with a quiet tightening in Henry's mind, the kind that keeps a person awake long after the candles have burned low. As we drift into this next chapter, let your breath soften and imagine the hush of an early morning corridor, long before the servants stir, where a king paces in silence, rehearsing arguments to God, to himself, and eventually to the entire Catholic world. Henry's desire to end his marriage to Catherine of Aragon was not merely a personal wish. It became a crisis that unfurled across courts, kingdoms, and centuries, reshaping England in ways no one at the time could fully understand. At the core of it all sat a question so deceptively simple that it echoed like a riddle. Was Henry's marriage to Catherine lawful in the eyes of God? People at the time debated this with the intensity usually reserved for battles or inheritance feuds. Henry, who had once defended the Pope in print and earned the title Defender of the Faith, suddenly found himself studying scriptures with the energy of a student cramming before exams. Leviticus 20:21 became his favorite verse, the one he read again and again, insisting that by marrying his brother's widow, he had invited divine punishment. Historians still debate whether he truly believed this or merely clung to the verse because it offered the neatest escape path. Whatever the truth, it became the scripture that stood between a king and the marriage he had grown to resent. But the matter was never purely religious. The political climate of Europe twisted itself around Henry's problem like ivy around stone. Catherine's nephew, Emperor Charles V, was one of the most powerful rulers in the world, and the Pope at this time was not in the habit of angering him. Charles had recently sacked Rome, a rather forceful way of influencing papal decisions, and Pope Clement found himself in the awkward position of having to choose between Henry's annulment and keeping the Holy Roman Emperor from bursting through the door again. It is little surprise which option he leaned toward. In this odd way, Henry's love life was held hostage by European geopolitics, a detail that can feel strangely humorous if you imagine the Pope quietly muttering no every time Henry's envoys arrived bearing letters. Henry at first tried diplomacy. He asked respectfully, then he asked firmly, then he sent Cardinal Wolsey to negotiate. Wolsey, usually brilliant at political maneuvering, found himself trapped in a labyrinth of papal delays and imperial pressure. The Pope agreed to send a legatine court led by Wolsey and Cardinal Campeggio to England, but it soon became clear that it was more of a performance than a legal process. Campeggio delayed for months, avoided direct judgment, and arrived with instructions to stall until the Pope could quietly pull the case back to Rome. By the time the legatine court collapsed in 1529, Henry's frustration had spilled far beyond private chambers and into the public tension of the entire kingdom. Wolsey's failure marked the beginning of his downfall. The man who had guided Henry through diplomacy for years suddenly found himself out of favor. The king loved results, not explanations, and Wolsey had produced none. Accused of treason, he was stripped of power and died on his way to trial, leaving Henry without the most skilled manipulator he had ever known. Some nobles celebrated Wolsey's fall with a touch more enthusiasm than politeness, though no one celebrated too loudly in case Henry changed his mind. Yet the king did not change his mind about the annulment. If anything, his resolve hardened. Anne Boleyn encouraged him to consider a different path, one that would involve challenging the supremacy of the Pope altogether. This idea, once unthinkable for Henry, began to seem more like destiny as frustration grew. Anne presented him with writings from reformers, books that argued for the authority of Scripture over papal decree. Henry read these works at night when the palace fell quiet, perhaps savoring the thrill of rebellious reading. One unusual detail from this time notes that Henry occasionally scribbled in the margins of books, underlining passages with the kind of intensity that reveals both irritation and delight. Anne was not the only influence. A clever scholar named Thomas Cranmer proposed that Henry should consult European universities for opinions on whether his marriage violated divine law. The idea appealed to Henry's theatrical sense of justification. Imagine receiving letters from scholars in faraway lands who had only heard rumors of your marriage, each offering learned paragraphs about your marital fate. Some supported Henry, some did not, and some produced arguments so complex they likely confused everyone involved. But the point was clear. The case could be judged outside of Rome. The more Henry considered breaking from the Pope, the more the great matter transformed into something larger than himself. Cromwell, rising quietly into prominence, saw opportunity in the chaos. He encouraged Henry to assert royal supremacy over the English Church, a concept that thrilled Henry in the same way tournament victories once had. The idea that the king himself could hold the authority that had belonged to the Pope was intoxicating. The seeds of reformation began to grow, watered by ambition, resentment, and the promise of control. Still, Catherine refused to bend. She insisted her marriage was lawful, that she had come to Henry as a virgin after Arthur's death, and that papal dispensation had been properly granted. She faced councils of clerics, ambassadors, and even Henry himself with unwavering steadiness. She would not agree to an annulment, not even to secure her own comfort. Her resistance added a moral gravity to the situation that made Henry's determination look harsher by contrast. Yet he pressed on, convinced that God himself supported his cause. By 1531, the tension reached a breaking point. Henry separated from Catherine, removed her from court, and positioned Anne more prominently in his daily orbit. England held its breath as the king moved steadily toward a religious and political rupture that no one could reverse. The great matter had grown too large to remain a private struggle. It had become a national crisis and a continental spectacle. And even as the path ahead darkened with uncertainty, Henry stepped forward, believing that destiny waited just on the other side of defiance. The Reformation in motion did not begin with a sudden strike like lightning, but rather with a slow, steady reshaping of the ground beneath England's feet. As we settle deeper into the story tonight, let your breath loosen and imagine the quiet rustle of parchment in a dimly lit chamber where men whisper about laws, power, and the unsettling possibility that the world may soon look different from the one they knew. Henry believed he was simply solving a personal dilemma, but the steps he took set England on a path toward transformation that stretched far beyond his marriage to Anne Boleyn. What began as a king's frustration soon became the reordering of an entire religious landscape. Thomas Cromwell, who had risen with the subtlety of a man who understood precisely when to speak and when to hold his tongue, became the chief architect of the shift. Cromwell saw opportunity in Henry's struggle with Rome and began to envision a realm where the king, not the Pope, held final authority. He had a legal mind that could unravel centuries of tradition and reweave them into something that looked deceptively simple. His arguments rested on a principle that seemed both radical and strangely logical. The idea that England was, and always had been, an empire unto itself, with no earthly authority above its own monarch. Historians still debate whether Cromwell believed this wholeheartedly, or whether he saw it as a convenient ladder of ideology, but whatever the truth, He presented it with the conviction of a man who knew his king needed to hear it. Henry liked the idea very much. A king who had long enjoyed pageantry and command suddenly found himself tempted by the prospect of spiritual supremacy as well. The acts of the Reformation Parliament began to flow like a river-gathering force. Each act pushed England a little further from the Pope until suddenly the distance between them was not a crack but a chasm. The Act in Restraint of Appeals in 1533 declared that no English subject could appeal to Rome in religious or judicial matters. It was a quiet legal sentence with thunderous implications. Now the highest court in England was England itself, and conveniently its final judge was the king. One of the unusual details from this period is the way Cromwell used printers to spread the idea of royal supremacy. Pamphlets and translations of Scripture circulated more widely than ever before, some of which carried subtle encouragements toward reform. Imagine small sheets of paper being passed from hand to hand, tucked into sleeves, or read aloud in taverns, shaping opinions one murmured conversation at a time. The printing press, that relatively new marvel, became an unlikely ally in Henry's theological rebellion. Anne Boleyn also played a role in pushing reform forward. Her interest in religious texts, especially English translations of Scripture, influenced Henry's spiritual curiosity. She carried books in her chambers that questioned certain Catholic traditions, and she offered Henry passages marked with neat corners, inviting him to consider the possibility that faith might not require papal direction. Whether Anne genuinely believed in reform or simply used these ideas to strengthen her position remains a subject scholars still debate. Yet her influence was undeniable. Her presence sharpened Henry's desire for independence from Rome. As the break with the Pope grew nearer, the court trembled with uncertainty. Some nobles embraced the change eagerly, sensing the winds turning. Others watched in fear, especially those whose wealth and influence were tied to traditional structures. Cardinal Fisher and Thomas More, both esteemed for their intellect, openly refused to acknowledge Henry as head of the Church of England. Their stands would later cost them their lives, but in these early years they represented the unsettling possibility that the age-old foundations of English spirituality were cracking. By 1534, the Act of Supremacy completed the break. Henry was declared the supreme head of the Church of England, a title he wore with both pride and the faint unease of a man stepping into unfamiliar territory. The Pope responded with excommunication, which Henry met not with sorrow, but with the stubborn satisfaction of someone who believed he had made the only rational choice available. England, whether it wished to or not, had entered a new era. Cromwell moved quickly to establish order. He reorganized ecclesiastical authority, introduced visitation commissions to inspect monasteries, and prepared the crown to absorb the wealth of the religious houses. These inspections produced reports filled with accusations of misconduct, some legitimate, others conveniently exaggerated. The goal was clear: dismantle the monastic backbone of the old religion and redirect its resources toward the crown. The first closures began in 1536. Small monasteries dissolved quietly at first, though the sounds of heavy doors closing echoed far beyond the cloister walls. Ordinary people felt the shift too. Sermons began to change tone. Parish rituals were adjusted. Priests found themselves caught between loyalty to the old faith and obedience to the new order. Some embraced reform eagerly, while others whispered prayers in secret corners, uncertain which devotions were still safe. The atmosphere carried a tension both exciting and unsettling, like watching a bridge being rebuilt while still standing on it. Amid all this, Henry walked with the confidence of a man who believed he had finally aligned himself with divine will. He viewed the great matter as resolved, the marriage to Anne as lawful, and the Church as restored to its proper place under his leadership. In truth, the work had only begun. But Henry, pleased with the sweeping power he now commanded, saw the shifting religious ground as a sign that England had been set right at last, even as the earth continued to tremble beneath the weight of the changes he had unleashed. The fall of Anne Boleyn arrived with the quiet eeriness of a storm that people swear they never saw coming, even though the sky had been darkening for months. As you ease into this part of the story, let your breath soften and imagine the cold stone corridors of the Tower of London. the sound of soft footsteps echoing, the kind of stillness that settles before something irreversible takes place. Anne had risen higher than almost any woman of her age, and now she stood on ground that could crumble beneath her with the slightest political shove. Her marriage, once the blazing center of Henry's world, was beginning to dim. Anne's early years as queen shimmered with promise. She carried the crown with the elegance expected of a Tudor monarch, and with a spark that made her captivating to watch. Yet beneath the golden silk, her hold on power depended almost entirely on one fragile thread: her ability to give Henry a son. Historians still debate whether the pressure of this expectation contributed to her miscarriages, or whether her pregnancies simply fell victim to the harsh unpredictability of early modern medicine. Whatever the cause, each loss fed Henry's growing anxiety, and the court began to murmur that perhaps the marriage had never been blessed at all. Anne's miscarriage in January of 1536 marked a turning point. The child had been a male fetus brought forth too early, its life unable to take root. The loss struck Anne deeply, and those who described her grief spoke of a woman who understood that her hopes were slipping from her grasp. The timing worsened the blow. It occurred just days after Catherine of Aragon's funeral, a coincidence that gave Henry a grim sense of providence. Some whispered that it was an omen clearing the way for a new path. Henry's reaction was less poetic than that. His frustration hardened into something much colder. At the same time, Anne's political enemies sharpened their knives. Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, found himself increasingly at odds with her. They clashed over foreign policy, over charitable patronage, even over the vast wealth taken from the monasteries. Cromwell favored a direction that Anne opposed, and in the web of Tudor power, disagreement with the Queen could quickly become dangerous. Cromwell sensed that Henry's affection for Anne was fading, and he did what skilled ministers often did in Tudor courts. He aligned himself with the king's shifting mood. Anne's relationships within the court did not help her cause. She had a bold spirit and spoke more freely than most queens dared. Her sharp tongue, once part of her charm, became a liability. She had openly confronted nobles, teased courtiers, and made enemies among those who preferred quieter women. There was one odd rumor that she occasionally joked about Henry's poetic attempts, a dangerous choice in a world where kings preferred admiration to honesty. Small slights piled up until they formed something like a case, or at least the shadow of one. Henry's attention had already begun to drift toward Jane Seymour, a quiet woman from an old noble family whose gentleness stood in stark contrast to Anne's intensity. And the Seymour family maneuvered carefully, presenting Jane as modest, obedient, and unthreatening. She lowered her eyes, spoke softly, and gave Henry exactly what Anne had refused in their earliest days: distance until a proposal was promised. Henry, ever drawn to novelty, let himself drift toward this new companionship with the eagerness of a man who believed sanctuary lay in simplicity. Then came the accusations. Cromwell, moving with calculated precision, gathered testimonies that painted Anne as an adulteress. The charges were sensational, claiming she had taken lovers among the men of her household, including her own brother, George Boleyn. Modern historians still debate the validity of these accusations. Most agree the evidence was flimsy at best and fabricated at worst. But in Tudor England, truth mattered less than the king's will. Once Henry accepted the idea of Anne's betrayal, the machinery of justice turned rapidly toward her destruction. Between April 30th and May 2nd, several men were arrested, including Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, Mark Smeaton, and Anne's brother George. They were interrogated under pressure, and Smeaton, the lowest born among them, confessed, though likely coerced. His confession became the cornerstone of a case built almost entirely on fear and ambition. The unusual detail that often surprises readers is that the dates of the alleged affairs were impossible at times when Anne was either pregnant or recovering from childbirth. But impossibility never stopped Tudor justice when the king desired a particular outcome. Anne was arrested on May 2nd and taken to the Tower of London. Those who saw her arrive reported that she moved between calm dignity and moments of trembling disbelief. She asked repeatedly where the charges had come from and how the king could believe such lies. Her words, preserved in fragments through observers, paint the portrait of a woman wrestling with betrayal in its rawest form. She had risen from lady-in-waiting to queen, only to find herself now more alone than she had ever been. The trial on May 15th was a spectacle attended by peers and courtiers, some of whom had once praised Anne with extravagant flattery. The outcome was predetermined. She was found guilty of adultery, incest, and treason. Even the charge of witchcraft appeared as a whispered accusation, hinting at the same superstitions that had once been thrown at powerful women across history. Cromwell had built a case strong enough to justify Henry's wishes, and that was all the court needed. On May 17th, the accused men were executed. That same day, Cranmer annulled Henry's marriage to Anne based on Henry's prior relationship with her sister Mary, making the marriage invalid from the start. It was a legal twist that erased both her queenship and the legitimacy of her daughter Elizabeth in one stroke. 2 days later, Anne herself faced execution by sword rather than axe, a final gesture of mercy arranged perhaps by Henry or perhaps by Cromwell, depending on whose version one believes. Anne died with calm resolve, holding her dignity even as the wind stirred around the scaffold. Those who witnessed her final moments remarked that she seemed strangely peaceful, as though she had accepted her fate with a grace uncharacteristic of the fiery woman she had once been. And when the sword fell, the court shifted instantly, almost unnervingly, toward preparing Henry's next marriage. Anne's rise had been spectacular, but her fall was swift, a story of love, ambition, danger, and a kingdom trembling on the edge of transformation. Jane Seymour entered Henry's life with the quiet steadiness of a lantern carried into a storm, its glow soft but unwavering. As we drift deeper into the story tonight, let your breath ease. Imagine the gentle creak of floorboards in a Tudor palace late at night, and picture a king exhausted by years of conflict, desire, and disappointment, finding himself drawn toward a woman who spoke softly, moved gracefully, and never once raised her voice above the hum of the court. Jane's presence marked a shift in the rhythm of Henry's world. After the turbulent brilliance of Anne Boleyn, Jane seemed like calm water after a tempest, or at least Henry convinced himself of this, which mattered far more than truth. Jane belonged to a noble but not particularly powerful family, the Seymours of Wolf Hall, though her relatives were skilled at bending with the political winds. She had served both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn as a lady-in-waiting, learning by observation how queens rose and how they fell. She was neither as educated as Catherine nor as dazzling as Anne, yet she possessed something the court often undervalued until it was needed deeply: gentleness. One unusual detail that survives from those who knew her is that Jane embroidered constantly, stitching delicate patterns onto cloth, as if calming her own anxieties through needle and thread. In a court filled with ambition and noise, that quiet craft made her stand out. Henry noticed her softness at a moment when he was desperate for emotional shelter. The accusations against Anne, the trials, the executions, the annulment, all unfolded with such rapid violence that Henry appeared to stagger beneath the weight of it. By the time he was free to marry again, he clung to the idea of innocence and moral renewal, and Jane, with her downcast eyes and serene manners, offered exactly that. The Seymour family recognized the opportunity long before Jane did, encouraging her to keep her distance until Henry's intentions grew so strong that refusal became impossible. It was a masterclass in political timing. They married just 10 days after Anne Boleyn's execution, a speed that made even seasoned diplomats blink. Yet Henry insisted on the haste, explaining that the kingdom needed stability. The wedding was small, private, and almost eerily quiet compared to the glamorous celebrations of his earlier unions. Jane seemed overwhelmed by her new role, but accepted it without hesitation. In private letters, foreign ambassadors wrote that Henry appeared more content in these first weeks of marriage than he had been in years. Whether that was truth or illusion is something historians still debate, but what mattered most was Henry's belief in the gentleness Jane represented. As queen, Jane focused her efforts on healing the fractured relationships within the royal family. She reached out cautiously to Princess Mary, whose status had been tossed about like a ship in stormy seas during the Boleyn years. Jane encouraged Henry to reconcile with his daughter, and though Henry's pride made the process slow and occasionally petty, Jane's persistence eventually brought Mary back into her father's favor. This effort alone earned Jane a lasting reputation as a peacemaker, someone who used her influence not to elevate her own kin as Anne had done, but to mend what had been broken. Yet even with her calming presence, the court beneath her feet remained restless. The kingdom was still adjusting to the dissolution of monasteries, the enforcement of royal supremacy, and the shifting winds of doctrine that left priests and commoners equally uncertain. Jane, though personally conservative in religion, navigated these changes with care. She avoided public disputes over theology, a wise decision in a household where religious arguments had already cost more than a few people their lives. Her focus remained on family, modest rituals, and the hope of giving Henry what he wanted most, a son. In 1537, after a year of marriage, Jane became pregnant. The court held its breath. Henry's joy was immediate and absolute. He arranged celebrations before the child was even born, and showered Jane with attention that surprised those who had known him as fickle and restless. For once, his focus seemed steady, anchored by hope rather than obsession. Throughout her pregnancy, Jane moved with a kind of luminous calm, though childbirth in Tudor England carried dangers that hovered like silent shadows. Midwives, physicians, and attendants crowded her chambers with whispered prayers, herbal mixtures, and anxious glances. The birth came on October 12th. After a difficult labor, Jane delivered a healthy son. The palace erupted. Bells rang across London. Bonfires lit the night sky. Henry finally had what he believed fate had long denied him: a male heir, Prince Edward. The joy was immense but short-lived. Jane weakened rapidly in the days that followed, likely from complications of childbirth. Her fever rose steadily, and the physicians of the time, with their limited knowledge, could do little except offer comfort and prayers. 10 days after giving Henry his long-awaited heir, Jane Seymour died. The court fell silent. Henry withdrew into mourning so deep that even his closest advisers moved cautiously around him. One odd detail speaks of Henry refusing to see anyone for days, emerging only to stare at the cradle where Edward slept, as if unable to reconcile joy and grief. Jane became, in Henry's memory, the wife who had given him a dynasty, the one he later claimed to have loved the most. Whether that was an honest confession or a story he told himself to ease the pain is something scholars still debate, but in the end, it hardly matters. Jane's legacy became entwined with the birth of a future king and the image of quiet devotion Henry cherished. Her funeral was one of the most elaborate ceremonies of Henry's reign, and he ensured she was buried at Windsor, the resting place he would one day share with her. Jane's time as queen had been brief, almost like a soft sigh between two storms, but her impact was profound. She had brought peace to a divided family and given England a male heir, securing her place in Tudor history with a grace that outlived her short years on the throne. England, in the years following Jane Seymour's death, felt like a kingdom being pulled in two directions at once, half anchored in ancient traditions and half racing into a future no one fully understood. As we settle into this next part of the journey, let your breath ease and picture the landscape of the late 1530s. Quiet villages tucked among rolling fields, monasteries standing dark and hollow as their last monks packed their belongings, and across the realm a faint hum of unease as people try to understand what exactly their king has done to the country's spiritual backbone. The dissolution of the monasteries remains one of the most dramatic upheavals in English history, and it unfolded with the slow, crushing weight of an avalanche. Thomas Cromwell, having risen higher than almost anyone without noble blood, became the architect of this transformation. He saw the monasteries as political liabilities, economic opportunities, and theological remnants of an old world no longer aligned with Henry's authority. Under Cromwell's guidance, royal commissioners were dispatched across the country to inspect religious houses and gather reports on their conduct. These reports, known as the Valor Ecclesiasticus, recorded financial records, land holdings, and in many cases accusations of moral failing. The unusual detail that scholars still discuss is how conveniently these accusations appeared. Some were undoubtedly true, others suspiciously tailored to justify closures. But the crown accepted them eagerly. Small monasteries fell first in 1536. their lands seized, their treasures catalogued, their sacred spaces stripped of relics. For many villages, these houses had served as hospitals, schools, and places of refuge. Their removal left wounds that would take generations to heal. Monks and nuns, suddenly homeless, walked away from cloisters where they had spent their entire lives. Some found pensions, others drifted into obscurity. Ordinary people watched silently as buildings that had stood for centuries were emptied in a matter of days. The closures alone might have been tolerated by a resigned population, but when Cromwell and Henry pushed further, aiming to dismantle all monasteries large and small, the tension snapped. In the autumn of 1536, the Pilgrimage of Grace erupted in the north of England, a massive uprising fueled by fear, anger, and devotion to the old religion. Tens of thousands gathered under banners bearing the 5 wounds of Christ, marching not for rebellion but for restoration. They wanted the monasteries protected, the old faith honored, and Cromwell removed. The symbolism of the movement ran deep. Some records describe entire villages joining together, their footsteps echoing across the moors as they carried their grievances southward. Henry, however, responded not with compromise, but with calculated deception. He invited the rebel leaders to discuss their demands, promising leniency. The rebel commander, Robert Aske, believed the king was sincere and urged the pilgrims to disperse peacefully. It was a tragic miscalculation. When further unrest broke out weeks later, Henry seized the chance to void his promises. Aske and dozens of others were arrested. By the following year, approximately 200 participants were executed. The pilgrimage had dissolved as abruptly as it began, leaving grief and fear in its wake. Historians still debate whether Henry had ever intended to negotiate or whether he viewed the entire uprising as a challenge to be crushed. Given the king's temperament, the second explanation often feels more convincing. With organized resistance silenced, the remaining monasteries collapsed quickly. By 1540, most had surrendered. Their lands went to the crown, though much of it was soon sold to noble families, transforming England's social landscape. Wealthy landowners expanded their estates, and a new class of gentry rose, many enriched by purchases of former monastic farmland. The countryside itself began to change as old stone cloisters crumbled and new manor houses rose in their place. Henry himself profited immensely. The wealth seized from the church surpassed anything collected by earlier kings, allowing him to fund grand building projects, coastal defenses, and, naturally, new military campaigns. Yet, despite these benefits, he lacked the financial discipline of his father, Henry VII. The money poured out almost as quickly as it came in, spent on palaces, wars, and displays of royal magnificence. The Reformation had given Henry power, but also the illusion that the treasury was bottomless. It was not. Meanwhile, religious practices across the kingdom shifted in ways both subtle and unsettling. Shrines to saints were destroyed, relics confiscated, and pilgrimages discouraged. Parish altars were simplified, images removed, and old rituals carefully adjusted to reflect Henry's middle road between Catholic tradition and royal authority. Cromwell encouraged the spread of English scriptures. One of his commissioners famously discovered villagers reading the newly available Bible aloud in groups, passing the book among themselves with awe. But the changes confused many. Some feared that too much reform would invite divine wrath, while others believed England had not reformed nearly enough. The atmosphere was thick with contradiction. Henry's own beliefs remained complicated. He rejected papal authority but not Catholic doctrine. He defended traditional sacraments even as he dismantled the institutions that upheld them. And his religious identity was not shaped by theology, but by power and personal preference. This led to one of the oddest details of the period. He sometimes punished reformers for heresy, even while approving policies they supported. It was as though Henry demanded reform on his terms alone and would tolerate no interpretation but his own. Cromwell, however, embraced a broader vision. He saw England moving toward a more scriptural form of worship, influenced by Protestant ideas from the continent. This divergence between the king's desires and Cromwell's ambitions created a tension that simmered beneath the surface. For now, Cromwell still held the king's trust, but the court had begun to whisper, sensing that the minister who had risen so quickly might soon find himself too tall for safety. A Tudor court was a place where even the greatest minister walked on ground that could shift without warning. Through all this, Henry moved between grief for Jane Seymour and hope for the future. The son she had given him grew strong, a living symbol of the dynasty Henry believed he was destined to secure, but the nation he ruled was changing so rapidly that even its king sometimes seemed caught off balance. The monasteries were gone, the church remade, and the social order reshaped. England had stepped into a new world, one built on the ruins of the old, and the king at its center walked forward believing he had finally placed the kingdom firmly under his command, even as the consequences of his choices continued to unfold all around him. Anne of Cleves arrived in Henry's imagination long before she arrived in England, her presence shaped first by paint, politics, and a remarkable optimism in the power of portraiture. As we drift into this new chapter, let your breath soften and imagine a quiet winter morning in court, frost on the windows, ambassadors whispering in silk-lined corridors, and a king pacing in heavy furs as he contemplates the question that had begun to weigh on him once more. He needed a wife, he needed alliances, and for the first time in years, he needed both at the same moment. The suggestion of a German princess from the Duchy of Cleves seemed almost perfect on paper. Of course, paper has deceived more than one monarch in history. Thomas Cromwell, still at the height of his influence, though certain enemies had begun sniffing the air for weakness, pushed for the match. Europe had shifted again. France and the Holy Roman Empire were at peace, and England hovered uncomfortably in the space between their rivalries. A marriage into the Protestant-leaning states of Germany could provide a counterweight should France and the Empire turn their combined attention toward England. Henry, always wary of being the odd king out in continental politics, found the logic persuasive, and so Cromwell sent the famed painter Hans Holbein to capture the likeness of Anne of Cleves and her sister. Holbein, perhaps unaware that his brush carried the future of a marriage, painted Anne with delicate precision, soft shading, modest attire, serene expression. She looked composed, entirely respectable, and, most importantly, agreeable. When Holbein returned, Henry studied the portrait with the hopeful eagerness of a man who wanted badly to be impressed. He pronounced Anne fair, not dazzling, not breathtaking, but fair. And for Henry at this stage of his life, fair was enough. The king had grown heavier, wearier, and less eager for romantic theatrics. A political marriage promised stability, and Cromwell assured him that the Duchy of Cleves would stand firmly with England. Historians still debate whether Holbein painted Anne with flattery or whether Henry's expectations had become unrealistic after years of idealizing beauty. Whatever the truth, the portrait sealed Anne's fate. Preparations began for her journey. Anne herself had been raised in a household that valued modesty, needlework, and the sober etiquette of the German courts. She was untrained in music, unversed in flirtation, and entirely unfamiliar with the elaborate social choreography of Henry's England. One unusual detail about her upbringing is that she had been taught to read, but not to write, a surprisingly common distinction for noblewomen in certain German territories. She spent her days embroidering and learning household management rather than the French court graces that had shaped Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. In many ways, she came to England prepared for partnership, but not for pageantry. Henry, filled with anticipation, arranged a romantic first meeting in the traditional chivalric style. He disguised himself and rushed forward to greet Anne upon her arrival at Rochester, expecting that she would recognize him by instinct or at least by theatrical charm. She did not. She offered a polite greeting to an unknown man while Henry stood there, costume and hopes deflating like a poorly tied festival banner. It was a moment both awkward and heartbreaking, though perhaps funniest to everyone except Henry. When he later saw her in full formal setting, unmasked and undisguised, he found himself disappointed. He declared, with the tact of a man unused to disappointment, that she was nothing like her portrait. The marriage went forward anyway. Politics, not preference, forced Henry's hand. Cromwell urged him strongly to proceed. Withdrawing now would humiliate England diplomatically. Henry agreed, though he made his displeasure known to anyone who had the misfortune to share a corridor with him. The wedding took place on January 6, 1540, attended by courtiers who tried very hard to keep their expressions neutral. The morning after, Henry complained loudly and repeatedly that the marriage had not been consummated. His reasons were delivered with the dramatic flair of a man who had no interest in hiding his dissatisfaction. According to reports, he insisted Anne's body and presence did not move him, offering descriptions that were unkind enough to make even seasoned ambassadors uncomfortable. Yet Anne herself adjusted to life in England with impressive calm. She enjoyed card games, tried to learn English customs, and treated Henry with a quiet politeness that suggested she hoped things might improve. But hope alone could not bridge the gulf between them. Henry could not love her, and Anne could not transform herself into the woman he wanted. Meanwhile, Cromwell sensed that the king's frustration was growing dangerously close to anger, something no advisor wished to endure. The political alliance that justified the marriage collapsed almost as quickly as the romance. The Duke of Cleves began negotiating peace with the emperor, leaving Henry's marriage strategically pointless. Cromwell's entire argument had been built on alliances, and once those alliances shifted, his enemies surged forward. Norfolk, Gardiner, and others at court whispered that Cromwell had overreached. The king, in his dissatisfaction, was ready to listen. By early summer, Henry sought a way out. Investigations uncovered that Anne had once been informally betrothed to another man, a pre-contract that provided the legal grounds he needed. Anne, remarkably perceptive, did not resist. She understood the danger of defying Henry, where Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn had not. She agreed to an annulment. For her compliance, she received generous estates, including Richmond and Hever, and the title the King's Sister. It was perhaps the happiest possible ending to a Tudor marriage that could have ended far worse. Cromwell, however, was not so fortunate. His enemies seized the moment. They blamed him for the failed marriage, accused him of heresy, treason, and a host of vague offenses tailored to destroy a minister who had grown too valuable and too powerful to survive. Henry, disillusioned and eager for someone to blame, allowed Cromwell's arrest. The man who had engineered England's greatest religious transformation found himself dragged to the same scaffold that had ended so many fates he once directed. His execution on the 28th of July, 1540, marked the fall of one of the most brilliant architects of Henry's reign, and Henry, on that very same day, married again. The king moved forward quickly, as he always did, not lingering on the wreckage behind him. Anne of Cleves settled into a peaceful life in England, safe from further danger, perhaps grateful to be free of royal expectation. Cromwell's fall sent tremors through the political landscape, and Henry, now reinforced by a new alliance, stepped into the next chapter of his reign, unaware that the turbulence ahead would prove even more costly. Catherine Howard entered Henry's world like a spark tossed into dry straw, small enough at first to seem harmless, but destined to flare into a blaze that no one at court could ignore. As you settle into this next part of the story, let your breath soften. Imagine the hushed chambers of Whitehall at dusk, tapestries swaying gently with winter drafts, and a king in his late 40s watching a young woman move through the court with a bright laugh and a softness he had not felt in years. Henry was aging, his leg pained him constantly, and his spirits were heavy from political failures and personal losses. Catherine arrived as a sudden burst of warmth, youth, and flattery at a time when the king needed them most. Catherine came from the powerful Howard family, though her own upbringing was far from the careful education given to noble daughters destined for greatness. After losing her mother, she spent her youth in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, where supervision was more theoretical than actual. Her childhood chambers were filled with other young wards, music teachers, household attendants, and a near-continuous swirl of gossip, flirtation, and chaos. One unusual detail from this period describes how the girls in the Duchess's care often kept sweetmeats and small contraband treats hidden in their bedding, something that paints a surprisingly vivid picture of youth in a house where rules existed mostly on parchment. In that environment, Catherine had developed attachments to two men before she ever reached Henry's court, and those attachments, innocent or not, would become the seeds of her undoing. When Catherine entered Anne of Cleves's household as a lady-in-waiting, Henry noticed her almost immediately. She was around 17, with a soft face, musical voice, and a manner that seemed to radiate affection. Henry, in contrast, was a heavy, limping man in middle age, but Catherine's gentle attention seemed to lift the weight from his shoulders. Courtiers soon learned that complimenting Catherine in Henry's presence was a safe way to brighten the king's mood. He found excuses to visit Anne's chambers, lingering far too long for propriety, watching Catherine with a mixture of awe and hunger. The Duke of Norfolk and other conservative nobles recognized an opportunity and quietly encouraged the match. Catherine was presented not only as a companion, but as a promise of renewed youth, pleasure, and perhaps another male heir. Henry married her on July 28, 1540, the very day Thomas Cromwell was executed. The contrast between those two events, one a public end, the other a joyful beginning, knitted together a single truth about Henry's court. Nothing remained still for long. With Catherine, Henry behaved like a man transformed. He showered her with jewels, gowns, and estates. He called her his rose without a thorn, and walked with a liveliness that shocked those who had been watching him shuffle grimly for years. The court took on a brighter energy. Feasts multiplied. Music filled the halls again. Even foreign ambassadors who liked to observe without sentiment noted the king's visible delight. But beneath the surface, Catherine's past lurked like a shadow creeping slowly across the palace floors. During her time in the Dowager Duchess's household, she had formed an attachment to Henry Mannix, a music tutor, and later to Francis Derham, a young man with whom she may have shared an intimate relationship. Historians debate the nature of these early romances, whether they were consensual, pressured, or simply youthful missteps. The truth remains tangled in biased reports gathered long after the events. What is certain is that Catherine had once referred to Derham as her husband in the manner of a youthful vow, and that Derham considered their relationship binding. At court, Catherine surrounded herself with familiar faces from her childhood, including some who knew her earlier secrets. One of these attendants, Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, became her closest confidant. Jane was a complicated figure, a widow of George Boleyn, and a woman whose motives have been analyzed endlessly across the centuries. Some view her as loyal, others as dangerously unstable, but in Catherine's household she became both advisor and companion. With Jane's encouragement, Catherine began a dangerous flirtation with Thomas Culpeper, a handsome courtier close to the king. Culpeper charmed easily, and Catherine, whose life had suddenly shifted from carefree youth to suffocating queenship, found herself drawn to him with a mixture of longing and recklessness. Their secret meetings were arranged under the cover of darkness, facilitated quietly by Jane Rochford. Whether these meetings were romantic whispers or something more is still debated, but impropriety alone was enough to court disaster. As Catherine moved deeper into forbidden territory, the tremors of danger began to spread. It was Archbishop Cranmer who first received the allegations. He hesitated before presenting them to Henry, knowing the king's volatile nature and the affection he held for Catherine. When he finally approached Henry with the truth, Henry reacted first with disbelief, then grief, and finally a roaring fury so fierce that even his closest advisers stepped back. Investigations unfolded with Tudor efficiency, which is to say rapidly and severely. Derham, brought forward as part of the inquiry, revealed Catherine's past, and under pressure accused Culpeper of current involvement. Culpeper confessed to clandestine meetings. Jane Rochford broke under interrogation. Catherine herself, confronted with evidence, collapsed into panic. In one unusual detail noted by witnesses, she begged to see Henry and plead her case in person. Henry refused, unable or unwilling to face the girl he had adored. The rejection spoke volumes. By November 1541, Catherine Howard was stripped of her title as queen. Her terror grew daily as she was moved to Sion Abbey, where her youth and inexperience became painfully visible to those guarding her. Reports describe her wandering her chambers in despair, whispering prayers, and asking whether Henry might show mercy. But Henry was not inclined toward mercy when he felt betrayed. The same king who once renamed her his carefree rose now signed her death warrant with a steady hand. Culpeper and Derham were executed first. Catherine and Jane Rochford followed on February 13th, 1542. Catherine was so frightened that the executioner had to guide her trembling body to the block. Her final words asked for forgiveness, a plea that echoed through the cold courtyard of the tower. She died young, barely more than a girl, swept into a world too sharp and too dangerous for the life she had known. Henry's sorrow after her death was real, but short-lived. The court that had shimmered with youthful energy under Catherine Howard fell into a grim hush. Henry withdrew, mourning the loss of youth more than the loss of the woman, and England braced itself once again for whatever the king might do next. The cycle of desire, hope, betrayal, and downfall had played out yet again, leaving behind the quiet imprint of a queen whose flame burned swiftly and extinguished far too soon. Catherine Parr stepped into Henry's life not as a spark of romance or a symbol of youthful delight, but as a steady hand reaching through fog to guide a king who was growing weary, heavier in both body and spirit, and increasingly surrounded by the shifting loyalties of a court that moved like water beneath him. As you settle into this next chapter, let your breath ease. Imagine the dim glow of candles in the royal chapel, the soft rustle of prayer books, and the quiet presence of a woman whose calm intelligence would not only soothe a turbulent king, but also help shape the future of England's royal children. Catherine Parr was unlike any wife Henry had chosen before her, and perhaps unlike any he could have handled earlier in his reign. She was twice widowed by the time she entered Henry's orbit. Her first two marriages had been arranged, dutiful, and politically practical, but they had also shaped her into a woman of measured judgment and quiet resilience. Catherine possessed an education that rivaled some of the scholars of her age. She read Latin with ease, spoke French and Italian, and held a strong interest in theology. One unusual detail that often surprises people is that Catherine Parr may have been the first woman in England to publish books under her own name. It is a testament to her confidence, her intellect, and her ability to navigate a world in which women's voices were usually confined to private chambers. When Catherine came to court, she did not seek Henry's attention. In fact, she had hoped to marry Thomas Seymour, the charming brother of Jane Seymour. But Henry, now in his early 50s, saw in her something he desperately needed: patience, steadiness, and a sense of moral clarity. He proposed with the insistence of a king unused to refusal, and Catherine, understanding both danger and duty, accepted. She married Henry on July 12, 1543, entering the role of queen with the grace of someone who knew exactly what it required and what it could cost. As queen, Catherine Parr became both caretaker and companion to Henry. His injuries from the old jousting accident still festered, the ulcer on his leg causing constant pain. His weight continued to increase, trapping him in a cycle of discomfort and frustration. Catherine tended to him gently, overseeing his medicines and organizing his chambers so that his days followed a careful rhythm. Her presence soothed him, and Henry, who had often drifted between affection and fury with his previous wives, found in Catherine a calming force that even he could not disrupt. But Catherine was more than a nurse to the king. She was a political mind in her own right. She believed deeply in reformist ideas and encouraged Henry to support the translation and reading of scripture in English. Her salons drew scholars, theologians, and noblemen into discussions that would have been unthinkable under earlier queens. Some historians argue that she helped stabilize the religious direction of the monarchy at a time when England stood precariously between Catholic tradition and Protestant reform. Others suggest she simply offered Henry the intellectual companionship he had once admired in Catherine of Aragon, but had not recognized the value of until much later in life. Catherine's influence extended beyond religion. She showed genuine affection for Henry's children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, and worked tirelessly to mend the fractures left by years of marital turbulence. She encouraged Henry to restore his daughters to the line of succession, a feat earlier wives could never have achieved. Elizabeth, in particular, viewed Catherine as a mentor, absorbing from her the habits of reading, debating, and studying that would later define Elizabeth's own reign. One odd detail that emerges from Elizabeth's letters is her mimicry of Catherine's writing style, a kind of intellectual homage from a young mind hungry for guidance. Yet Catherine's reformist beliefs placed her in danger. Conservative factions at court, led by Stephen Gardiner and Thomas Wriothesley, watched her influence with increasing suspicion. They feared she was guiding Henry too far toward Protestantism, and they plotted to bring about her downfall the same way they had undermined queens before her. They presented Henry with evidence claiming Catherine had been spreading heretical ideas and encouraging religious radicals. In a moment of irritation, perhaps fueled by pain or by the whispering of those who knew how to manipulate his moods, Henry signed a warrant for her arrest. When Catherine learned of this, she acted with remarkable composure. Instead of confronting Henry with anger or fear, she approached him with humility. insisting that she had spoken about religion only to comfort him during the moments of suffering and that she never intended to challenge his authority. She framed her discussions not as debates, but as a wife's attempt to soothe her husband, reminding him that she was his loyal supporter and servant. Henry, touched by her response and perhaps embarrassed at how easily he had been swayed by courtiers, forgave her. The very next day, when the guards arrived with the arrest warrant, Henry famously dismissed them with irritation, claiming they must be mad to think he would harm his queen. Catherine had survived what had destroyed others. In the final years of Henry's life, Catherine became the quiet engine that kept the court functioning. She managed household affairs, oversaw the education of the royal children, and maintained a sense of order even as Henry's health continued to decline. His moods swung between affection, frustration, and long periods of brooding isolation, yet Catherine remained steady, guiding him with patience that bordered on saintly. When Henry died in 1547, Catherine's role as queen ended, but her influence lingered. She remarried Thomas Seymour months later, seeking the affection she had once dreamed of, though the marriage brought its own complications. Still, her final legacy lay not in her personal life, but in the stability she provided at a moment when England most desperately needed it. She had helped secure the succession, preserved the education of two future queens, and guided a king through the last and most fragile years of his reign. Catherine Parr was not the most famous of Henry's wives, nor the most tragic, nor the most politically explosive, but she was the one who stitched the fractures left by years of turmoil, offering England a kind of healing that history often overlooks. Her wisdom, her patience, and her quiet strength shaped the Tudor legacy in ways that would echo long after Henry's voice fell silent. The last years of Henry's reign unfolded beneath a sky that seemed to darken a little more with each passing season, as though the realm itself understood that the king who had once leapt onto horses with effortless grace now struggled simply to climb a staircase. As you ease deeper into this part of the story, let your breath settle and imagine the slow shuffle of footsteps in a drafty palace corridor, the heavy tap of a cane against stone, and a king whose body had begun to betray him, if not in spirit, then in strength. Henry's late reign was a landscape shaped by war, wealth, fear, and ambition, all stitched together by a man determined to command England even as his health drained piece by piece. War continued to pull Henry across the map of Europe, even when he no longer had the vigor to lead campaigns himself. His appetite for military glory had never faded, though his body no longer matched his imagination. In 1544, he launched another invasion of France, a two-pronged plan involving both Norfolk and Suffolk. The effort strained England's treasury to the breaking point. Supplies grew thin, soldiers complained about unpaid wages, and the cost of fortification projects climbed higher each month. The most expensive venture was the campaign at Boulogne, a siege that stretched toward misery and triumph in equal measure. Henry visited the site in person, riding in a cushioned litter rather than on horseback, an odd sight for a man who once prided himself on athletic prowess, but he refused to be absent from the spectacle of his own campaign. The siege succeeded, and Boulogne fell to English hands. Bells rang, cannons roared, and Henry basked in the glow of victory. Yet the triumph was hollow. Maintaining control of the captured port cost more each week, and the French retaliated with relentless raids along the southern coast. In 1545, the French fleet attempted to invade England, sparking a naval clash near the Isle of Wight. The battle ended indecisively, but it produced one of the most haunting images of Henry's late reign, the sinking of the Mary Rose. The great warship rolled and vanished beneath the waves in full view of the English fleet. Some believed she carried too much weight. Others blamed a sudden gust of wind. Historians still debate the true cause. But to Henry, the loss cut deep, a reminder that even the mightiest creations could fail without warning. War bled money from the royal coffers at an alarming speed. To compensate, Henry debased the currency, mixing metals into the silver coins until their value shrank like cloth washed too many times. This decision created the inflation across the realm, pushing the price of grain upward and sowing quiet discontent in kitchens and marketplaces. The king, who once enjoyed the wealth seized from monasteries, now found himself scrambling to fund the military machine he had built. It was a bitter irony that the riches gained from tearing down the old religious order had not been enough to support the ambitions that replaced it. While foreign battlefields drained wealth, domestic politics drained patience. The court became a nest of factions and whispers. Reformers and conservatives circled each other like dancers in a tense masquerade, each group waiting for the king's mood to shift in their favor. Henry's beliefs remained as inconsistent as ever. He defended traditional doctrines one week and approved reform-minded sermons the next. One unusual detail describes him personally crossing out passages in prayer books he disliked, a reminder that religious policy in England was often shaped not by councils or scripture, but by the ink of a king suffering from chronic pain. His leg, the wound festering from the old jousting accident, had grown worse. It swelled, leaked, and burned with constant infection. Physicians opened and drained it with the limited knowledge available to them, packing it with ointments that carried strong smells through the corridors. Servants sometimes reported hearing Henry groan as he moved, though he tried to hide the sound when courtiers were near. Pain made him irritable, suspicious, and prone to sudden rages. Yet it also made him cling more fiercely to the illusion of strength. He wore furs heavier than comfort required, and armor that pinched against his increasing weight. He would not allow frailty to be seen as weakness. Despite his suffering, Henry devoted significant energy to securing the future of his dynasty. He issued the Third Succession Act, restoring both Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession after Edward. The act represented a rare moment of generosity and a practical acknowledgement that the Tudor line might need every legitimate heir it could claim. Catherine Parr's influence helped guide Henry toward this decision, but the king himself understood the necessity. He was building a future he would never witness, but one he wished to control from beyond the grave. Foreign diplomacy mirrored Henry's inner conflict. One month he courted alliance with the Holy Roman Emperor. The next, he reached toward France again. His letters brimmed with promises that contradicted each other. Ambassadors attempted to decipher his intentions while quietly noting that the king seemed confused or distracted during negotiations. Some suggested his memory faltered in his final years, though whether this was illness, exhaustion, or simple frustration remains debated. Henry's physical decline was no secret. He struggled to ride, he struggled to walk, he struggled even to sleep. Servants carried him between chambers on specially made chairs and supported him during ceremonies so that he could maintain some semblance of royal dignity. His frame grew massive, his once athletic limbs now swollen. Boils and pain distorted his daily movements, and he often withdrew from public events to rest. Yet when he emerged, he demanded full respect, full obedience, full acknowledgement of his royal authority. The king was failing, but the crown remained unbent. These final years were marked by contradictions. The king who had torn down monasteries spoke reverently of traditional worship. The man who spent fortunes on war claimed to desire peace. The ruler who executed wives and ministers still longed for loyalty and companionship. He was neither hero nor villain in these moments, but a man caught between the weight of his past and the limits of his aging body. And so England watched, waiting for the inevitable end, as the king who had reshaped its faith, its politics, its economy, and its very identity pushed onward through pain and uncertainty. The wars he waged, the wealth he spent, and the shifting alliances he forged left marks across the kingdom that would echo long after the last light faded from his reign. The final days of Henry's life settled over England like a long twilight, the kind that lingers on the horizon long after the sun has slipped away, casting everything in muted shades of memory and exhaustion. As we drift into this closing chapter, let your breath soften. Imagine the slow toll of a distant church bell, the cold air of a winter palace, and a king whose footsteps had grown faint though his shadow still stretched across every corner of the realm. Henry VIII, once a figure of athletic brilliance and roaring charisma, had become a man caged by his own body, ruling mostly from a bed surrounded by velvet curtains and the constant scent of medicinal oils. By the mid-1540s, the signs of his decline were everywhere. His leg, the wound that had haunted him for a decade, swelled and burned with such intensity that he needed mechanical devices to move it. Servants had to assist him into specially reinforced chairs. His once quick stride had collapsed into a slow shuffle, and at times he could not reach the council chamber without being carried. Courtiers who had once seen him leap into saddles now whispered in shock at the sight of his massive frame supported by attendants. Though none dared express pity, Henry despised pity almost as much as he despised treachery. Despite his failing health, his mind remained fixed on power, order, and legacy. He kept a watchful eye on court factions, which had grown sharper as his strength faded. The conservatives under Norfolk and Gardiner circled like wolves waiting for the chance to reclaim influence, while the reformist faction surrounding Catherine Parr, Edward Seymour, and Cranmer clung tightly to the hope that the future would lean toward Protestantism. Henry, ever unpredictable, drifted between them as the mood suited him. Some days he praised reform, encouraging English scriptures. Other days he demanded the harsh punishment of radicals. One unusual detail described in diplomatic letters suggests Henry occasionally forgot which policy he had approved earlier in the week, giving contradictory instructions with the calm certainty of a man who expected obedience regardless of logic. In these last years, Henry's heir dominated his thoughts. Prince Edward grew under the care of tutors who filled his days with Latin, scripture, and mathematical exercises. Henry adored the boy in a restrained, distant way, gazing at him during formal visits with a pride that softened his expression even as pain etched deeper lines into his face. He wanted desperately to secure the kingdom for Edward, to build a scaffold of laws and alliances sturdy enough to support a child king. The prince's health, however, seemed delicate. Henry saw the thinness of his limbs and the pallor of his skin, and worried. Historians still debate whether Henry feared Edward might not survive childhood, or whether he simply wished the boy to grow into a king untouched by the storms of his father's making. Mary and Elizabeth also returned to the center of court life in these years, walking carefully along paths Henry had reshaped for them. Mary remained devoutly Catholic, Elizabeth leaning quietly toward reform. Catherine Parr worked tirelessly to keep harmony between them, knowing that Henry's approval could shift in an instant. One of the few moments of gentleness recorded from Henry's final years occurred during a winter celebration when he insisted both daughters stand beside him, one on each side, as symbols of unity. Whether this gesture came from affection or from political theater is something chroniclers interpret in varying ways, though it remains one of the softer images from a reign marked by sharp edges. Meanwhile, Henry's foreign policy spiraled into desperation. Relations with France remained tense, with Bologna draining resources. The Holy Roman Emperor shifted alliances once again, leaving England exposed. Henry continued writing letters filled with grand promises and veiled threats, though ambassadors noted that his correspondence grew more erratic. The once brilliant strategist who had navigated Europe with theatrical flair now seemed to rely more on stubbornness than vision. His council filled the gaps as best they could, though the jostling for dominance beneath the surface hinted at the chaos that would erupt after the king's death. By late 1546, Henry's health collapsed sharply. He slept more hours than he woke. His appetite changed unpredictably. Some days he demanded elaborate feasts, other days he ate little more than broth. Physicians hovered constantly, applying poultices to his swollen leg, preparing mixtures that promised comfort but delivered little. The king's temper flared in these moments, and he lashed out at anyone unfortunate enough to bring unwelcome news or interrupt his sleep. Yet there were also quieter days when he listened to music or allowed his children brief visits, his voice softened by the weight of approaching mortality. As the winter of 1546 turned toward the new year, Henry's body began to fail completely. He could no longer stand without assistance. His breathing grew shallow. Court observers noted that he rarely spoke above a whisper. The air around him thickened with a strange mixture of reverence and dread, for no one had ever known England without Henry VIII, and no one knew what shape the kingdom would take after he was gone. On January 28, 1547, the king slipped from life. The attendants at his bedside recorded only that he passed quietly in the early hours, the same day that would have marked his father's 90th birthday. The death of a man whose voice had thundered across decades came not with spectacle, but with stillness. His body was placed in a simple coffin, and the great machinery of the Tudor court immediately shifted its weight behind Edward, 9 years old, and suddenly King of England. Henry was buried at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, beside Jane Seymour, the one wife he had chosen as his eternal companion. The elaborate tomb he had commissioned remained unfinished as ornate elements scattered across workshops and storehouses. In time, some of those designs would be repurposed for other monuments, a quiet irony for a king who sought permanence in every decision. His actual resting place, modest compared to his ambitions, holds the weight of his story, a reign marked by grandeur, fear, creation, destruction, and the relentless pursuit of legacy. And so the reign of Henry VIII ended not with a parade of triumph, but with the slow closing of a heavy door, leaving behind a kingdom transformed and a history forever shaped by the man who once believed he could bend an empire to his will.